Hey guys, I'm coming at you from my studio down here in Lynchburg, and I often come down here on Sundays to not only have some peace and quiet, but do some lecture prep. And if I have time, this is where I come to get some cool creative stuff going and do some projects on my own to keep the creative juices flowing, as they say. So, pardon my disheveled appearance. I often have like these black cloths over my head when I'm working with like darkroom cameras and running around outside and getting all sweaty. So I apologize. I'm wearing my silver nitrate stained apron. But yeah, if you guys are ever curious about what the heck I do, or if you're interested in coming down and checking out some alternative processes, get your hands dirty old school style, let me know. We do cool stuff down here. Anyways, I'm going to jump right in. I think last week was maybe a tad intimidating. I hope you don't think that every lecture is going to be an hour and 15 minutes, because I literally had my voice going hoarse last week because I was doing so much talking. But honestly, that was the hardest lecture. From here on out is truly smooth sailing, and our lectures are probably going to be just closer to 30 minutes, honestly. Because then I want you to take that extra time and I want you to go post your picture in the discussion board and respond to other people's images. So that's what I want our Tuesdays typically to look like. And so I apologize, the last Tuesday was a little intense, but hopefully today will be a lot less so. Just a quick snapshot of what the rest of the semester is going to look like. Our lectures are pretty simple from here on out. We are going to have just a couple more weeks talking about the exposure triangle and the components. We are going to skip ISO. I hope nobody's offended by that, but I feel like ISO doesn't really need an entire week devoted to it. We are going to talk about aperture and shutter speed a bit more, and just give a little bit more of a more expansive understanding of really what that means, how that looks in your camera, and what kind of results you can get from it. Then we're going to jump into light. There's a variety of different lights, as I'm sure you know. And so each week we'll talk about a different type of light, and hopefully our photo shoots will help us to sort of demonstrate some of those. And then after that, we're going to get into different elements of composition. And so hopefully by the end of the semester, you'll have an understanding of how your camera works. You'll be shooting in manual, no problem. You'll understand light and what type of light you want for each situation that you're shooting, and then throw some composition techniques in there, and you're going to be golden and be taking awesome shots on the regular. So I can already see it. Hopefully you guys can too. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you so we can go ahead and do this PowerPoint thing. I do just want to reiterate, if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to just shoot me off an email. Some of you have located my phone number, which I believe I put on the syllabus, and you're welcome to do that. So I want to make sure that you guys aren't missing out on the opportunity to have your questions answered. I don't know if you guys noticed, but on Thursdays, I tend to get a little bit swarmed by people. That's normal. I love it. I was telling Emily Atwood the other day when we were meeting that I'd like to think it's because I'm so popular, but really I think it's that people are under the guise that I'm the one who has the answers, which I don't even know if that's true. So yes, don't ever hesitate to ask a question in class, but also if you feel like it's hard to reach me in class, then please shoot me off an email or text me, or we can even set up a Zoom meeting if you feel like you need a little bit more time and explanation. So having said all of that, without further ado. All right, guys. I know we've already discussed a little bit about aperture last week as one of our three components of our exposure triangle. This week, we will be discussing a little bit more in depth, doing a little bit more studying into aperture and sort of how it's been used since the beginning of photography. So let's jump right in. Okay, so I just pulled this off the internet real quick. This is similar to probably many of the aperture charts that you found for your sketchbook or that was included in the initial PowerPoint. I actually really like this one because it gives a lot of information. It's talking sort of about the depth of field, the focal length, what's in focus, what's not, but then also what it does to your light. And then obviously it shows an example of what the aperture might look like. So I think this is cool. Feel free to snag it and put it in your sketchbook if you think this might be helpful. So let's just real quick, we're going to look at the aperture diagrams and just do a quick recap. Okay, so a wide aperture or a big hole is going to make it so that a very narrow depth of field is in focus. So your subject's in focus and everything from your subject to the horizon is out of focus. Now, a very small hole or a very small aperture is actually going to give you a large depth of field where almost everything is in focus, your subject all the way back to the horizon. Okay, and then obviously there's a spectrum of apertures in between, but those are sort of the extremes of it. And so as sort of that precursor, let's talk a little bit about sort of where the creativity of aperture originated from and what sort of these early photographers thought about it. Okay, so pictorialism versus purism. What the heck does that even mean? I'm going to tell you, let's check out this definition. It says pictorial photography is a style in which the photographer has somehow manipulated what would otherwise be a straightforward photograph as a means of creating an image rather than simply recording it. Now, I think this definition is really funny because I think even in our very syllabus, I'm talking about how I personally believe that the purpose of photography is to learn how to make images instead of taking them. And so this is an interesting way to look at it. This idea of pictorial photography is actually a style where you create images rather than just simply recording them. So keep that in mind. And as you even just sort of look at the image that's on the slide, it is a very soft, sort of romantic image. Even the coloring of it and the lighting and sort of her halfway closed eyes and the way her neck is sort of tilted back and she's sort of looking over her shoulder, the draping of the cloth that's on her hair and just sort of the way her hair is falling on her shoulder. The whole thing is meant to be just sort of dreamy and soft and almost even painterly. And back in the day, this is what we were coming from, right? We were coming from this Renaissance art that echoed a lot of these ideas and feelings and nuances. And again, we have a very similar image where we have trees that sort of fade back into the background with a really soft depth of field. We have the reflections in the water and sort of these leading lines that again we'll talk about later, but even the sky is very soft and sort of painterly. And I think we can sort of see figures in the background that are walking across it. So it almost has a dreamlike feel. It's almost as if you're looking at a painting. And I think that's exactly what the artist was going for. Okay, so in contrast, let's look at what pure photography is and how it's defined. Pure photography or straight photography, which it's also referred to as, refers to photography that attempts to depict a scene or subject in sharp focus and detail in accordance with the qualities that distinguish photography from other visual media, particularly painting. So it's they're almost saying like, hey, these crazy people who are taking the medium of photography and making their photographs look like paintings, these people are preposterous and they need to be stopped. Now, they felt really strongly about it. It was almost like politics, right? You're either on one side or the other. You either believe that photographs were meant to be, were meant to mimic sort of this Renaissance art and have the ability to do that, or you felt that it was a waste of technology, essentially, and a waste of incredible detail to just waste it away on a shallow depth of field where everything's soft focus. So people felt very strongly about this. Okay, just a couple other examples of straight photography. Here we are looking at an image that looks to be the front of an old home, maybe out in the country in a field somewhere. The paint's peeling. It is a very deadpan type of a perspective. We can see every little detail, and it looks very much like it would if you were to be literally standing in this field staring at it. And another example, I mean, this is an absolutely gorgeous picture, but again, if we were sort of on a hill overlooking the scene, this is very much the way that the eye would probably capture the photograph. Granted, it would be in color, but we see all the way from the foreground to the background to that back skyline of mountains, and then even the sky itself, and everything in between is always going to be in focus. That's just how our eyes see scenes like this. And so I guess the idea is do we want, as photographers, do we want to depict scenes exactly the way that our eyes see them? Is that the point of the craft? Or do we use the medium of photography to depict the scenes before us in a more sort of whimsical, dreamlike way? And maybe that's sort of the artistic element of it. Okay, so I just want you to be thinking of those two concepts as we sort of move forward and talk a little bit more. Group F64. This was the first sort of, for lack of a better term, like bad A photography group back in the day. These people felt very strongly about straight photography or pure photography that we talked about in our second slide or third slide, whatever it was. They called themselves Group F64. Now, as many of you are probably figuring out, F64 is an f-stop, and it is sort of, at least with the cameras back then, F64 is sort of the highest that you could go with some of these old school cameras. And they were all about shooting all the way up at F64 because to them, that represented the capability of the camera, that the camera can do what no other medium can. It can capture in a way that is pure and truthful like no other medium can. And they believed that it was a pity to not take advantage of it in that way and to not use its sort of exact qualities. Now, some of the photographers on this list you've probably never heard of, but some of them I imagine you have, especially the first one on this list, Ansel Adams. Now, for those of you who are familiar with him, he was a fantastic landscape photographer that took amazing images of a lot of the natural parks that we still look at today. And so we are very grateful for his work. And he's a perfect example of what this pure photography looks like. It is detail from the foreground all the way to the background and everywhere in between. The perspective would look exactly as you were standing there. No, I'm just going to read this for entertainment purposes, but this club felt very strongly to the point where they wrote a manifesto. And its manifesto said this: Group F64 limits its members and individual names to those workers who are striving to define photography as an art form by simple and direct presentation through purely photographic methods. The group will not show work at any time that does not conform to its standards of pure photography. Pure photography is defined as possessing no qualities of technique, composition, or idea derivative of any other art form. The production of the pictorialist of the pictorialist, on the other hand, indicates a devotion to principles of art which are directly related to painting and the graphic arts. I just think it's so funny that they just seem to get their feathers ruffled at the idea of a pictorialist that would be using principles of art that were directly related to painting and other graphic arts. There are still people today that I believe look at photography in a way where they believe it should just sort of stick with what it's good at, its exactness, and its ability to capture in the purest form exactly what our naked eye can capture. And I am grateful for the plenty of other photographers who believe that there is certainly beauty and inspiration to be found from the sort of soft, painterly expressions that can come through the photographic medium, regardless of its technological ability to be the most exact and the most literal medium that we have access. So which is right? Does anyone identify with one style over the other? Now, I would venture to guess that the majority of you probably don't feel that strongly one way or another, at least not to write yourselves a manifesto, although let me know if you want to write a manifesto and we'll get started on it. I can give it to you as a homework assignment. But I think I've already sort of shared my feelings. I personally am absolutely a pictorial photographer. There's just absolutely no doubt about it. If anything, I appreciate the dreamlike qualities that the camera has the ability to create, probably more than the next photographer does even. And so that's me personally. I think that there are landscape photographers in particular, or even some architectural photographers who just love the literal quality that the photographic medium provides to them. And so, guys, there's not a right or wrong answer here, right? Whether it's pure photography that gets you excited, whether it's pictorial photography that gets you excited, everybody gets to have their own opinion on this. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's no right or wrong answer here. You do you. All right, I'm going to show you yet another diagram about depth of field. I feel like this early in the game, it really can't hurt to just reiterate it a couple more times. So let's check out sort of this first diagram here. Look at the camera. It looks like we're shooting at f1.4. That's a very wide aperture. We're shooting wide open, as they say. And so it's letting in a lot of light. I hope it is we're in the shade, or it's a cloudy day or late in the day or something, because we're going to be letting in a lot of light to this camera with an aperture that is open that wide. But the wonderful part that is happening is that this subject is going to be very much in focus while everything around it is nice and soft. So a really shallow depth of field. I love shooting wide open just like this. I absolutely love it. So let's go down to the second one. We're now at 5.6, and you can see the aperture is closed up just a little bit. So it's letting in just a little bit less light now, but it has also sort of extended that depth of field. So now, whereas before we were just seeing our subject, now we're seeing a few more flowers in front of her. We're seeing some flowers behind her and more of the tree behind her as well. It's just widened that depth of field, and it's also limited the amount of light that's coming into the camera. So again, if you're taking pictures at an f1.4 and it's just way too bright and your pictures are being overexposed, pulling up that aperture is going to help you achieve a more appropriate exposure, because it's going to limit the amount of light that you're letting into your camera. And then let's go down to this third one. We're now at f22. The hole's nice and small, so we're letting in even a smaller amount of light now, and everything from the camera to back behind the tree and probably beyond is now in focus. Now you're going to have the opposite problem in this third scenario as you would in the first, which is that now you're letting in just a very small amount of light. And so now you better hope that it's like midday and you have lots of good light coming in from overhead. But the point is, you also have your two other elements of the exposure triangle, your shutter speed and your ISO, that will sort of help you to hone in on the appropriate exposure, regardless of what you've chosen your creative outcome to be. So let's take a look at some actual images that have a large depth of field, right? So again, with a large depth of field, we're going to have a really small aperture. This shot is gorgeous. Look at all the detail, all the texture. We get to see all of it, from the waves in the foreground that are hitting those rocks, all the little details of these buildings on the right. And as you sort of follow this like coastal line all the way to the back of the image, we can even see the texture of these mountains back here, and you can even see the detail in the sky. Okay, so there's absolutely something to be said, especially when you're talking about landscapes, to use this small aperture or this wide depth of field, this deep depth of field, because it has an amazing potential for detail and texture, and allowing the viewer to sort of take in an entire scene all at once. I want to just say a couple things about this image. The detail that is in this chain in the foreground is pretty insane. Part of the reason this image is sort of so interesting is because I'm assuming the lens that was used for it was a wide angle lens, and this person is squatting down, probably leaning against this chain and really getting it looking huge, even bigger than this bridge, right, in this image. And yet we still have a tremendous amount of detail in the bridge and even the mountains behind the bridge. I also want to point out the starred lights on the bridge. When you turn up your aperture, right, so you clamp down that hole and you make it really, really tiny, it makes your any light that's in your picture, whether it's lights on a bridge like there is in this one, or even the sunlight, or even light that is sort of reflecting off of something, like glints of reflection in the chrome of a car, or the way that light reflects off of dewdrops or something like that. Anywhere where you would just see sort of that reflection, you'll get this star out effect when you turn your aperture up, or again, when your aperture has a small hole and a large depth of field. It stars out any reflection. So if you think that's cool, that's how you do it. Now, large depth of field isn't just for landscape photographers. Food photographers or food stylists, I guess is what they're called, they absolutely love large depth of field because it allows all of their ingredients to be sharp and editorial, and have this really powerful look to it. And so this is a perfect example of that. A lot of times I'll do these overhead shots and they have to have their aperture. It certainly doesn't need to be up all the way to f/22, but they definitely want to make sure that everything from the top of this rolling pin all the way down to this marble or whatever these objects are sitting on, that everything is tack sharp. Okay, check this out. So we have an astrophotography image. I actually took this picture at Zion National Park, and you would think that you would want to have your aperture wide open in order to get as much light into the camera as possible. Now, typically this would be the case. The problem with doing that is because you're photographing the sky and a bazillion stars in the sky and stars that are so incredibly far away. You need to lengthen your depth of field as far as you possibly can. And so that is typically what you'll do. And that's why you see the mountains are in focus, the stars are in focus, and then even sort of the brush in the foreground is in focus. And that's because I actually had a very wide depth of field, which means I had a very small aperture. But because my camera was situated on a tripod and I was able to open it up for minutes at a time, it kind of didn't matter at that point what my aperture was set to, because I had control in other ways and I was able to let light in by simply opening my shutter for as long as I wanted to. So what creative qualities does a deep depth of field add to an image? I want you to think about that. We've just looked at all these beautiful images. We've looked at food photography. We've looked at landscape photography. We've looked at astrophotography. We've looked at sort of these aerial views of cities. So I guess the question is, are there creative qualities in deep depth of field? Right? Because this group F64 would say, no, there's no creativity. Don't even tell us that there's creativity involved. We are here to just capture the moment. But do you feel in the images that we just looked at that there was more sort of forethought that went into it? The time of day played a role. Did light play a role? Did areas of composition play a role? And if you do think it played a role, did it have an impact on the way that you viewed the image? Because if it did, I want you to consider how these elements of exposure, how light, how elements of composition play a role in the creative qualities that come out of an image, regardless of how literal it is to the way that the human eye would view that scene. I want you to realize that there are these other elements that absolutely play a role in making the image something that is beautiful to look at. So let's hop in now to a shallow depth of field. We're looking at a similar view. I mean, this could even be the same. It's not, but this could even be a similar harbor to what we saw in one of the first images that we looked at when discussing deep depth of field, right? But here we have a totally different viewpoint. We have it from a car window and we see the dashboard in the foreground with the out of focus mug and hat, and it gives such a different feeling to the photograph. And then everything outside of the photograph is nice and sharp, and we can see all the way back to the horizon and all the detail involved there. But there is something to be said, an almost photojournalistic feel that comes with this shallow depth of field. It helps us feel like we're a fly on the wall, like we're peering into somebody else's life. And I happen to love the way that is portrayed. Okay, so let's bring up this question one more time. What creative qualities does a shallow depth of field add to an image? I hopefully you've seen lots of examples as we just sort of went through several of these, but I do think, again, to reiterate, I do think that one of the most important and powerful elements of a shallow depth of field is that the photographer is given the ability to sort of dictate where their viewer's eyes will go in the image. So based on what they put in that shallow depth of field, it's just the way the human eye works. It goes to the part of the image that's the most in focus. And if it wants to wander around after that, that's fine. But I think that's pretty powerful because unlike a large depth of field where everything's in focus and the viewer gets to choose, what part of the image they start with and focus on, I really love the idea that the photographer gets to make that choice when they're dealing with a shallow depth of field. Guys, I gotta jump on one more time. These guys are total goofballs, and I'm really sorry. I hope that this video doesn't drive you completely insane. I really do like some of the things that they share, though, but the part I really want you to pay attention to is when they're talking about the different ways that you can increase or decrease your depth of field, because that's actually really helpful information. And I like that they can just show it to you because it's a video. They can show you exactly what that looks like in live format. So again, pay attention to that last part, because that's really going to come in handy as you're trying to either increase your depth of field or decrease your depth of field. They're giving you some really good tips and tricks that I want you to pay attention to. So just hang in there till the end. Okay.
Today we talk about something that's very important for both still photographers and filmmakers out there, and that is depth of field. Depth of field. Now, the easiest way to explain what depth of field is pretty much your zone of sharpness. Now, that range can be changed. You can move it towards and away from your lens. You can make that range longer to get more things into focus, and you can make that range much shorter or shallower to get very minute details in focus while throwing everything else out of focus. The reason why depth of field is so important is because it allows you to literally guide your audience's eyes to different portions of the screen that you want them to pay attention to. Different depths of field can also evoke different types of emotions.
In this example, we have two people waving at each other, and both of them are in focus, and that is because we have a deep depth of field. Now in the second clip, nothing changes except for our depth of field. It's now more shallower, and our eyes are drawn to the person close to the camera since everything else behind him is out of focus. Now this changes the feel of the shot almost entirely because now we see him much more separated from the other person in the scene, and this could mean some type of disconnection between the two characters. It also adds a little bit of mystery to the person in the background if we haven't introduced them yet. Now this is just one example of many, but you can start to see how depth of field is the opposite of coincidental, and it's very carefully planned out, and it can give a different tone and a different feel to each one of your shots depending on how you use it.
Now, there's three main elements that affect depth of field, and that is aperture, your focal length, and your subject distance to camera.
So at this point, we understand how aperture affects depth of field. A large aperture, or a small f-stop number, will give you a more shallow depth of field, while a small aperture, or a large f-stop number, will give you a deeper depth of field. Now, one thing that we haven't really talked about is how your focal length affects your depth of field. Now, focal length is pretty much involved whenever you're swapping lenses out. So if you're going from a 50mm to a 100mm, you're changing your focal length. Whenever you're changing your focal length, the longer you set your focal length, the shallower your depth of field is going to be. So if I go from a 50mm lens to a 100mm lens, my depth of field is going to become much more shallower. And then finally, your subject distance to camera is very simple. The closer your subject is to camera, the shallower your depth of field becomes. By creatively manipulating these three elements to your advantage, you can evoke different emotions from your shots, making your visuals an element of the story. So to sum everything up, if you want to increase your depth of field, you need to narrow your aperture, so you need to pick a larger f-stop number. You can also move your subject further away from the camera, or you can shorten your focal length. And you can use a combination of all three to get an even deeper depth of field. But if you're trying to do the opposite, if you're trying to decrease your depth of field to make it more shallow, you want to widen your aperture, so you want to pick a smaller f-stop number. You want to move your subject closer to the camera, or you can increase your focal length.